Welcome to ABC 10 in Focus. I'm Sam Ali, here with two very special guests, Cheryl Reed and Michael Williams from the center of the controversy at Northern Michigan. I guess you can start off, give yourselves a little bit of intro about what you guys do at NMU.
So I'm a faculty member. I was hired in August. I'm the English and journalism professor. I teach upper-level journalism courses, magazine writing, investigative reporting, that sort of thing. And then part of my duties is to be the journalistic advisor at the North Wind.
Michael?
Yeah, I'm a student. I came up here 3 years ago, and this is my second year at the North Wind. I've been a guest writer, staff writer, opinion editor, and now managing editor at the North Wind. So I've kind of moved through the ranks.
All right, let's get into it. I guess let's start not necessarily from day one, but when did the relationship between the paper and the university start, that you noticed there start to be some kind of a strain between them?
I noticed it somewhat when the students FOIA'd the Starbucks contract. That's when I started seeing things fall apart. Initially there were some emails going back and forth about them complying with the FOIA requirements, and us having to relate what the FOIA rules were. They were several days late, and then there was this confidentiality clause that they cited, which raised red flags for me because it's a public university, and therefore there should be no confidentiality agreements which preclude them from complying with their FOIA requirements. So that's when things started to get sticky. And then I think by the third North Wind board meeting, it was very, well, I think some people were upset because, particularly one of the administrators was upset because we had run a story, the North Wind had run a story about sexual assault on campus, and it was the parents' weekend, the Friday after we ran it. And so this particular administrator asked us point blankly why we had run the story, and the editor at the time said, we run stories as they are needed and as they're timely, and that was a timely story. The results had just been released, and they don't give any, they don't consider what is special happening on weekends in terms of news. You just go with the news, and it doesn't matter what time of year it is.
Michael, I guess talk to us about the newsroom environment, and with these stories specifically. Were these stories initiated by the students? They wanted to go in and explore what was going on?
Well, I need to clarify. I took last semester off from school, so I was not with the paper. My understanding of it was that they were students who wanted to pursue these stories, and they were not pressed upon to pursue these stories. I was here a year ago, and we were not pursuing these kinds of stories. And so I think part of the changing of the relationship between the editorial staff and the board is largely due to just a different nature of journalism being pursued at the North Wind.
Do you feel like that's the case?
Well, I think I want to clarify that the whole story started from a student who had never written a story, who was in my practicum class that I teach in coordination with the North Wind. So it's a class they have to take. Yeah. And the student had never written a story before. She was a multimedia student. She originally asked for the contract. She brought it up in our class and said, I really would like to get these contracts. How do I do that? And I said, well, it's a public university. You should just ask. So she started asking. She sort of fumbled around asking all kinds of people. And then finally the university just said, oh, you have to FOIA it. So actually, the whole controversy about the FOIA was interesting because it was the university telling this student who'd never written a story before, you have to send us a Freedom of Information Act request. She didn't know how to write it. She originally wrote it and sent it into the Ethernet somewhere, and then I had to sort of help her and guide her as to where to send it. So it was kind of a fumbling kind of, if you were Woodward and Bernstein, that's not exactly how you would have started,
Michael, I guess the transition that we've seen, like you said, with the journalists, how they're more investigative, has that been something that people have always wanted to do? Like even in the year that you've been there, is it something they just needed a push to go in that direction with the investigative journalism?
It's something I wanted to do, and I didn't pursue it when I was opinion editor. I kind of used my time there to do a few stories about, for example, I mean, the hardest piece I did when I was opinion editor last year was about increases in meth production and consumption in the Upper Peninsula, And I didn't, sleep over at a meth house. I was talking to legal officials about it, And so it was not investigative in nature, but it was informative. Yeah, I definitely wanted to. I can't really speak for the other members of the staff, but I didn't have the same mental resources then, or just resources in general with Cheryl to be able to tell me, okay, this is how you're going to go about it, kind of thing. And so I think it was just a different kind of atmosphere completely.
All right, that'll wrap up this segment of ABC 10 in Focus. Coming up, we'll talk about that big board meeting where the decision was made, and we'll have that right after this. Welcome back to ABC 10 in Focus. I'm Sam Ali, here with my guests Cheryl Reed and Michael Williams. So let's get into the board meeting and just walk us through what happened.
So at the April 3rd board meeting, the only thing that we knew that was on the agenda was that we were going to interview for Michael's position. He was the only applicant for the editor position. Traditionally, the managing editor would take, the editor's position, and so we knew that was on the agenda. And then there were these 2015, 2016 interviews. We had discussed at the previous meeting that these were going to be board. There were 3 open board positions, and so we thought that that's what that was going to be. We went into after we interviewed Michael, we were in a discussion, and then after the discussion of Michael, then the chair said, we have to make this decision about Cheryl. Well, had I known that we were going to be discussing my renewal, I would have involved my students. I would have asked that that we move out of executive session, because according to the rules of open meetings law, I have, as the person being discussed, have the right to ask that it be discussed in an open meeting. And that's exactly what I would have done, because I'm all about transparency in this situation. So, there was a lot of discussion. We've been warned not to discuss what happened in executive session by the board, so I'm not sure if all that is legal, but I'll tell you, whatever they discussed, it was no different than what they discussed in open meetings, so I'll characterize it in that sense. They were not happy about the way the newspaper had been run. And they were under the impression that if they just removed me, then all this investigative stuff would go away. That I was the culprit. I was the one pushing the students to do all this. And I don't think they realized that I'm a resource. The students wanted to do this, and they came to me and said, I want these documents. How do I get them? And I would explain, you ask for them, or you could FOIA them. All these students want a FOIA. They want the opportunity. We still have students coming in for next year. They're like, oh, I want to learn how to do FOIAs. I mean, this is exciting for journalists. This is an opportunity for them to learn a really critical tool in our business. So, I wasn't, coming into meetings going, we're going to FOIA. That wasn't something I did. Did I, Michael?
No, no. And I mean, I'd like to point out that Emma was asked to leave for my interview, which historically is not the case. Editors-in-chief are present for the interview of new candidates, and so that was this change, this big change. The executive session was this new.
We'd never done that before.
Right, it was this new thing that they decided to bring in. And they, were working on these bylaws for the new bylaws for the paper, and there were several changes to the bylaws. And one of the changes was that personnel who are going to vote on personnel cannot vote for themselves or vote on themselves. That's new. They implemented it in the middle of this meeting without implementing any of the other bylaws. And so there's this one bylaw that seems really important, and we're going to make Cheryl abstain from voting for herself, but all these other bylaws we're just going to ignore and implement next year.
one of the bylaws that we were supposed to implement dealt with the journalistic advisor. And so when we were redoing the bylaws, one of the things we wanted to do is make our laws standard to other newspapers. Other newspapers in the country have specific protections for the journalistic advisor because they're First Amendment protections. And so in the bylaws, the proposed bylaws, it says you can't discipline, dismiss, fire, or any of those other things, or retaliate against a journalistic advisor for protecting her students' First Amendment rights. And they were doing just that.
So we aren't going to implement that by law, but this one that Cheryl has to abstain from voting is really important.
What was the reaction of the students, I guess, because this almost directly impacts them when they heard about this? I'm guessing they were pretty not happy about it.
It's been mixed, it's been mixed. But
you mean in the newsroom or?
Yeah,
in the newsroom.
Oh,
it's unanimous. I mean, it was a general feeling of being really pissed off. And from outside of the newsroom, I've gotten a lot of support, a lot of people reaching out immediately as soon as it hit social media. Former students saying that this mimics what happened to Northern News in the 60s and the kind of autocratic administrations then, which has been really amazing to hear how history kind of repeats itself. But in the newsroom, I mean, there was one kind of unanimous opinion going on, which was, this is terrible.
And I guess since you brought it up, I guess on campus with the students, you said it's been a mixed reaction?
I think, I don't think, so one of the things that's happened this year with a lot of the FOIAs, the newspaper's been in this awkward position of having to write about itself in the sense that it's been in this battle with the Administration for Public Records. So I think there's been some reaction to that. There's been a lot of stories about the FOIAs, not getting documents. Also, the week prior to my non-renewal or whatever that was, the chair of the Board of Trustees sent out a campus-wide email disparaging the newspaper about a very accurate story about the Board of Trustees' expenses. So I feel like the students have been sort of inundated with all of this information. I'm not sure that they completely understand it. They just know that there's this thing going on between the administration and the North Wind, and what is it, and we want to stop hearing about it. Some people feel that way, and other people are very supportive.
The other thing is that this is the NMU has a new brand this year. It's Fearless Minds, and for me, there's this overwhelming irony about that brand. And so I think this new kind of brand campaign has been something of, it is fed into that element of mixed responses, where NMU looks shiny and new, but there's also this controversy with the paper.
Alrighty, that'll wrap up this segment of ABC 10 in Focus. On our next segment, we'll talk about the big lawsuit, and that'll come up right after this. Welcome back to ABC 10 in Focus. I'm Sam Ali, here with my guests, Cheryl Reed and Michael Williams. So let's get into the lawsuit, and I guess you can start off why you decided to bring this suit forward.
Well, once they had decided not to have Michael as the editor, and he was the only applicant, and once they had decided not to renew me as the journalistic advisor, we really felt we had no other remedies. And if you read the lawsuit, it goes back to September. I mean, there were these 9 months of violations that had happened, FOIAs that were not fulfilled. When the board decided not to pay the amount, it was $150 of a down payment so that the students could have access to public documents. I mean, that was a prior restraint. When my students were allegedly intimidated, when we had administrators meeting with students on the board and were never told anyone else on the board, this was never announced, and then we had emails that showed us that they had had these secret meetings. We felt that this was a lot of intimidation and harassment, and we had tried to meet with the administration, we had met with the president, and we just felt like it wasn't moving anything, and so we decided that a judge needed to decide.
And Michael, I guess if I could get your reaction to the statement that NMU put out, basically denying all these accusations.
Well, they're framing it as a faculty member suing students when it's dual plaintiffs, one of whom's a student, suing an administrator and 4 students. It was a very predictable PR tactic to shame Cheryl, and I think if you read the complaint, there's a pretty clear pattern that as you go down becomes increasingly difficult to deny, especially when you get to the open meetings.
And Cheryl, I guess you can get into the terms of this lawsuit, because there is no monetary attachment to this.
No, this is a philosophical discussion. It's not a monetary lawsuit. We're not asking for compensation other than attorney's fees, which are pretty typical. What we want is we want our rights. We want my students to have rights in terms of having access to public documents, having access to a resource of an advisor, having an editor who will be considered not based on content decisions, and we want the community as well to understand the First Amendment rights, because this is a discussion in the community as well as on the campus. And so I think a lot of times people don't understand First Amendment rights as they applied in modern venues. And this is one case which it may not be obvious that removing a journalistic advisor for stories that her students have done is a violation of the First Amendment.
Michael, tell me a little bit about why you felt compelled to get involved in this lawsuit.
Well, again, looking through the pattern, it becomes clear that this has been at least somewhat orchestrated by powerful people at NMU to disparage the Northwind and Cheryl. And this wasn't exactly in my 5-year plan, graduating high school, but I think if you had asked me then if I would be involved if I was willing to be involved in a lawsuit of this nature, I would have said absolutely, because this is about principles, and principles that I don't plan to give up anytime soon.
Cheryl, let us know, what's the end game? What you feel like, what do you hope to achieve when all this is said and done in terms of the lawsuit?
Well, hopefully the temporary injunction will put me back in place as the journalistic advisor, and then the lawsuit will explain in very expanded terms what is the First Amendment and how it's supposed to be applied on a campus. There was at least one administrator who kept saying in the board meetings, student journalists don't have the same rights as you, as corporate journalists, and I kept saying the First Amendment doesn't discriminate. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a really lack of understanding of what the First Amendment means. And so I'm hoping that both this is an attempt to educate the administration, an attempt to educate the students, but also the community, so they also understand how important it is to have student journalists.
Michael, it seems like the First Amendment, it's one of the more well-known amendments that we hope so. Why do you feel like it's somewhat being obscured in this situation?
Well, I don't think it's just this situation. It's a national trend for administrations to put down the iron fist on student journalists. There are journalism programs being cut everywhere. And so it's not, I don't want it to be contextualized as this situation. However, it's a, 25-page complaint?
28.
28-page complaint. You read through it, and it's a pretty clear-cut case, in my opinion. Obviously, I'm not a legal expert. And so I think it's an opportunity for a much larger discussion as well about the nature of student journalism on campus. And to answer your previous question, I really just want Cheryl as my advisor because she's been an incredible mentor to me, one like I've never had, and she's only shown me the most basic tools of journalism.
Alrighty, that'll wrap up this segment of ABC 10 in Focus. Next, we'll talk about the national recognition that this story is getting, and we'll get the reaction of Cheryl and Michael right after this. Welcome back to ABC 10 in Focus. I'm Sam Ali, here with my guests, Cheryl Reed and Michael Williams. So let's start off, because I know this story really did catch my attention from the article in the Free Press, but I guess what's your reaction to how much coverage this is getting across the country?
Well, I'm part of a larger, and Michael is now part of a larger fraternity of journalists. And when journalists are being attacked in one place, we sort of band together. Mm-hmm. And I've always said, journalists don't like when baby journalists are getting attacked. And I think that's true in this case. I mean, you have a situation where you have young journalist students trying to learn how to do FOIAs, how to get public documents, how to do basic investigative reporting. I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. And they've been hit on pretty hard. And I think it seemed like a clear-cut case. When you have the Society of Professional Journalists, the largest society of journalists in the country, coming out in support of us, when you have the Collegiate Media Association, and you have the Michigan Collegiate Advisors, and I mean, I could go on and on and on. I mean, there are all these journalist groups who feel this is a very clear-cut case of a First Amendment infringement. And that's because there have been all these other cases that have come before us where the same things that were done in this case were done in those cases, and the federal courts came down heavily on those administrations and said, you can't do this. So it's in our minds, and particularly in the journalist community, this is a clear-cut case.
Michael?
It's been really encouraging and overwhelming. I mean, it's many, many times sent shivers up my spine, to get this kind of roundabout recognition, from fraternities that I have nothing but admiration and respect for, and was hoping to join one day, And I can say that pretty much every interview I've done with journalists outside of the community, at the end of it, they usually say something like, hey, off the record, you're doing a good job, and you guys need to keep with it. So.
I know we've hit on this, but in general, how important is this, a situation like this, when it comes to journalism, because we are dealing with the First Amendment, not just specifically with NMU, but on a national scale. How important is something like this?
Well, maybe 20 years ago, this might not have been such a big deal, but I was in a newsroom where I watched many of my colleagues being laid off. Today, there are a third fewer journalists working than there were 10 years ago. So student journalists in communities such as Marquette are fulfilling a gap where there used to be a lot more journalists and a lot more stronger media companies. And so it's really important that our student journalists are protected and that their First Amendment rights are upheld.
Michael?
We're the next generation, and we need this kind of protection if we want to do the good work. I mean, the Pulitzers were announced this week, and there are a lot of community journalists from small towns who are nominated and chosen. It's not just big institutions that are important to our democracy. In my sense, I feel the Northwind is essential to Marquette.
Anything else you'd like to say finally, whether it be to the students or to the Northwind or to NMU? Anything you'd like to close with?
I think that a free press means that we all benefit.
And thank you to the community members who have reached out and told us to keep fighting.
Alrighty, thank you very much. That'll wrap up this show of ABC 10 in Focus. Join us again next week for another edition.